Screwtape, while not on a rampage, was in a decidedly foul mood. He hated Thanksgiving. An entire day dedicated to the highest form of thought these stupid creatures are capable of could only have been put into motion by direct action from the enemy himself.
If I have to put up with this nonsense each and every year, at least I can make the most of the opportunity of family and friends with different viewpoints together, and the stress of making a large meal looming in the background.
Screwtape, ever the opportunist, begins to do small things to turn the family members around the dinner table against each other, prodding one cousin to mention the upcoming elections, enticing the youngest and most favorite niece to move the most important silverware and then blame the other children for it, encouraging the mother to ask all the partygoers if they want seconds multiple times, and constantly moving the cranberry sauce away from the person who will want it next, so conversations are regularly interrupted or bad manners are regularly being pointed out. After sufficiently ruining the dinner and getting everybody to sit away from each other in the living and dining rooms, Screwtape begins to write at the dinner table as mother and son continue their now heated argument.
My dear Wormwood, I am very pleased by what you tell me about this man's relation with his mother, but you must press your advantage. The enemy will be working from the center outwards, gradually bringing more and more of the patient's conduct under the new standard, and may reach his behavior to the old lady at any moment. You want to get in first, keep in close touch with our colleague Globlos, who is in charge of the mother, and build up close between you and that house a good settled habit of mutual annoyance and daily pinpricks. The following methods might be useful. Number 1. Keep his mind on the inner life. He thinks his conversion is something inside himself, and his attention is therefore chiefly turned, at present, to the state of his own mind. Or rather, to that very expurgated version of them which is all you should allow him to see. Encourage this. Keep his mind off the most elementary duties by directing it to the most advanced and spiritual ones. Aggravate the most useful human characteristic, the horror and neglect of the obvious. You must bring him to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office. Number 2, it is no doubt impossible to prevent his praying for his mother, but we have a means of rendering the prayer innocuous. Make sure that they are always very spiritual, that he is always concerned with the state of her soul and never with her rheumatism. 2 advantages follow. In the first place, his attention will be kept on what he regards as her sins, by which, with a little guidance from you, he can be induced to mean any of those actions which are inconvenient or irritating to himself. Thus, you can keep rubbing the wounds of the day a little sore, even while he is on his knees. The operation is not at all difficult, and you will find it very entertaining. In the second place, since his ideas about her soul will be very crude and often erroneous, he will in some degree be praying for an imaginary person. And it will be your task to make that imaginary person less like the real mother, the sharp-tongued old lady at the breakfast table. In time, you may get the cleavage so wide that no thought or feeling from his prayers will be for the imagined mother will ever flow into this treatment of the real one. I have patients of my own, so well in hand that they could be turned at a moment's notice from impassioned prayer for a wife or son's soul to beating or insulting the real wife or son without qualm. And point number 3. When two humans have lived together for many years, it usually happens that each has tones of voice and expressions of face which are almost unendurably irritating to the other. Work on that. Bring fully into the consciousness of your patient that particular lift of his mother's eyebrow which he learned to dislike in the nursery, and let him think how much he dislikes it. Let him assume that she knows how annoying it is and does it to annoy. If you know your job, he will not notice the immense improbability of the assumption. And of course, never let him suspect that he has tones and looks which similarly annoy her. As he cannot see or hear himself, this is easily manageable. Point number 4. In civilized life, domestic hatred usually expresses itself by saying things which could appear quite harmless on paper. The words are not offensive, but in such a voice or at such a moment, they are not far short of a blow in the face. To keep this game up, you and Globos must see to it that each of these two fools has a sort of double standard. Your patient must demand that all his own utterances are to be taken at their face value and judged simply on the actual words, while at the same time judging all his mother's utterances with the fullest and most oversensitive interpretation of the tone and context and the suspected intentions, of course. She must be encouraged to do the same with him. Hence, from every quarrel, they can both go away convinced, or very nearly convinced, that they are quite innocent. You know, the kind of thing. I simply asked her what time dinner would be, and she flies into a temper. Once this habit is well established, you have the delightful situation of a human saying things with the express purpose of offending, and yet having a grievance when offense is taken. Finally, tell me something about the old lady's religious position. Is she at all jealous of the new factor in her son's life? At all piqued that he should have learned from others, and so late, when she considers she gave him such good opportunity to learn in childhood? Does she feel he makes a great deal of fuss about it, or that he's getting in very easy terms? Remember, the elder brother in the enemy story. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
Well, welcome back to Iron by Iron, where we sharpen each other and encourage you to get to the grindstone of God's infallible word. Professor Jayce is joining me today. I'm Sam Stone.
Senior Sam Stone.
To talk over this third Screwtape letter. So in this one, how to aggravate aggregates. So this idea, well, back up a little bit. The previous one we talked about when the patient that Wormwood is trying to deceive has become a Christian, and Screwtape tells him that the church is actually going to be a benefit to him, and if he can, not the church in its true form, but the church in the sense of when this man walks into a church, to make him jump to the wrong conclusions about those in the pews beside him, right? And there's this coming in to essentially strangers and making them in his mind be something other than they really are. Well, in this one, we see Screwtape now dealing with something of the same vein, but instead of with the stranger, with those closest to the man, his own mother, his own relations, people he actually has lived with in the same house. So he actually breaks this down into 4 simple steps. So, Jayce, what do you think here? So on the very first one, his advice to Wormwood is to keep the man's mind on his inner life, on his conversion is something inside of him, not to do with something outside of him, which is actually, well, I'll not give my commentary until you are done.
Oh, I'm done. Okay. Yeah. So I think the inner life comment is really, really interesting because Christianity is a religion that changes somebody from the inside out, right? But sometimes it does that by getting you to focus outside and then in. It's really, really weird. Like God wants you to focus on serving people, and that changes you internally.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's almost the inverse. Like, walking in a commandment in action on the exterior will over time actually change the heart of the interior.
Which is really interesting because later on in the letter, Screwtape talks about habits, right? So he is keenly aware that what you do affects what's going on inside of you, right? It's kind of like the idea of, if you want to build discipline in your life, you don't build discipline by saying, I'm going to think about being disciplined. You build discipline by doing stuff, and it develops the character trait of discipline in your life. And that's just kind of how it works, right? Our actions shape our internal lives and our internal, this is who we are.
Yeah, it's a principle, one that God's made, obviously. And here he seems to, it's tricky, actually. Again, I mean, the enemy's a liar. He's deceitful. He's cunning. And so kind of the bait and switch here is trying to get him to be focused on the inner life and only in the inner life, which is actually a form of navel gazing, of self-centeredness, of selfishness, all the things that we're supposed to not participate in. But he's like, hey, get himself focused by looking in his inner life, making him think that this rebirth is something primarily or strictly within the man. And this spiritual life does not reach beyond his mindset.
I like how he goes through all of that, and then he says, aggravate that most useful characteristic, the horror and neglect of the obvious. Like, it's obvious to Screwtape, it's obvious to Wormwood, it should be obvious to us as the patients that they're working on, right? That, this isn't just an internal thing. This should be something that we do outside, and it changes us inside as we do that. But he's like, no. They neglect the obvious. Just keep them, once again, this idea of ignorance.
Distracted.
Unaware of it. Distracted. Yep, exactly. Bring him to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself, which are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house with him or worked in the same office. Right?
Oof, that's heavy.
That's brutal, because I bet we've both thinking of moments where somebody's walked up and said something like, you have this habit of doing this, or you say this word a lot, and we don't even realize it until they mention it. And then you're keenly aware of it, and you go, oh, that's right.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think this is actually a really important reason to have good, spiritually in tune, and honest friends that you choose to surround yourself with. People that will tell you the truth, even when you don't. There's a proverb about the friend.
Hard truths.
Yeah, there's a proverb about the friend that tells you the truth versus the man who just tells you what you want and butters you up and compliments you, right? But isn't ever willing to give you the hard words when you need it.
Yeah, well, in Proverbs 31, it talks about the woman, and it says charm is deceitful, right? The idea of just saying what you want to hear, saying things that are nice to you is deceitful long term. It can be.
Yeah, that falls in right here. So keep him distracted, make him look inwardly, be self-focused, not outward on others, and actually through that purifying the inner man, right? And he actually brings up a good example. I believe it's on that first aspect where he's like, hey, maybe it's a little later, I can't remember, but he's like, you know what, make him when he prays for his mother, I think is what it is. Like,
that's part 2.
Yeah, she'd be praying for her spiritual needs, but don't ever even notice her rheumatism or anything physical. Like, just make this all like this kind of transcendent, like spiritual experience type thing, and not applicable to actually loving her in any way, shape, or form in person, in present, in the physical.
Screwtape spends a lot of time trying to get Wormwood to get the patient to separate the spiritual and the physical a lot. A lot of time trying to get them to separate the holistic human being as spirit and body into a spiritual aspect and a body aspect, which is really, really interesting to me. And I think Lewis does this purposefully because Weight of Glory, he talks about how, every person that you interact, only eternal things in the world are people, right? Everything in the world is going to get destroyed. It's going to get remade. And the only eternal things are people.
Yeah. That idea here, I think, like, you've never met a mere mortal, right?
Yeah. Everybody's either being moved towards becoming an eternal glory that if you saw them now at this point in history, you would be tempted to worship them because of how splendorous they are. And then the other flip side of that is if they're not moving towards becoming eternally glorified with God, they're turning into eternal horrors, right? So this idea of like the stuff that you do right now, the way that you interact with people is always helping them move towards one of those two things.
Yeah, there's no neutral either. Yeah.
We were just talking about the fence, right?
The devil owns the fence.
Yeah. Right? I own everything. Everything in this field belongs to me. And the dude's sitting on the fence, and the devil calls in. And he says, "All right, I want everything in the field." And he's like, "I'm on the fence. I own the fence."
Right?
Like, oh shoot, there is no neutral in this. Jesus says that you are either with him or against him.
Yep.
And we're moving people towards becoming more with him, or you're moving them towards becoming more against him.
Yeah, that's really weighty. Not to be punny here, but weighty substance there in our interaction with others to realize all that we say and do to them is to some level somehow pushing them one or other direction. And are we being conscious about which direction we're going?
Yeah, and this letter actually has the part of the entire book that makes me the most uncomfortable, which is saying a lot, because there are a few parts throughout Screwtape that are like give you a little bit of the feeling, at least for me. But this one at the end of part 2, I've had patients of my own so well in hand that they could be turned at a moment's notice from impassioned prayer for a wife or son's soul to beating or insulting the real wife or son without a qualm. Right? The thought that there are people that are like that, and the thought that that is something that's desired by Screwtape, and the thought that if you aren't careful with thinking about how you interact with God and how you view other people, that you could be praying for souls while physically abusing them or sending them, like, there's no way that that's moving somebody towards becoming eternal glory. That is eternal horror all the way. Right? That is my least favorite part out of all of these letters. Especially as a husband and a dad, it makes me feel nasty inside to read it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you there. Good point.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a little bit about part 3 here. Okay. When two humans have lived together for many years, it usually happens that each has tones of voice and expressions of face which are almost unendurably irritating to the other. What do you think about that? Because he talked about strangers in the last letter. How can we, how does that situation move over, get applied to people that we are relatively intimately acquainted with?
I actually really appreciate how he uses the example of the man and his mother, because I think that is a very aptly chose relationship for this to be in, because versus say a man and his wife, which I'll get to in a second. But yeah, so there's all these small, annoying, quirky things about us that when we live with somebody for a long extended time, they're usually things that if you know somebody as just an acquaintance or even a friend, you're not around them enough for them to really wear on you. But the day in, the day out, the constant, there's just some of those small, the way they say something, the tone that they say something, how they do this.
Maybe they hum while they do something specific and it just drives you crazy. It's the same song every time.
Yeah, and those things just grate on you, right? And just make you have a hairline trigger. And what's interesting here is Screwtape says, hey, these things are, well, for him, obviously, good. And he's like, leverage these, manipulate these, and make the patient think that the other one is doing it on purpose because they want to annoy him, right? It's not just a quirk, but it is actually intentionally done by them just out of spite.
Assuming motives.
Exactly. Assuming heart motives here. And then he's like, also, let him hold them to the standard, never thinking the standard applies to him in any way, right? So thinking to himself, I wonder if there's things that I do like that, right? And then having the grace, like, oh, yeah, there probably is. So I'll have grace with them. I mean, yeah.
No, instead it's like, oh, they do this just to annoy me. I'm going to do some things just to.
Yeah. Yeah, like you said, they do it to annoy me. Now I have license to do something in retaliation, right? To annoy them back. In fact, I don't know where I've heard this through many different people in different forms, right? But I think kind of it's this idea: don't contribute to malice that which can be easily explained by stupidity is a really good rule of thumb to live by. Because people, including myself, are apt to say really dumb things, and without even a lot of forethought on it, and then maybe even afterwards be like, oh shoot, I hope they didn't take it that way. I really didn't mean it that way, but I guess, now that I think about it in light of the conversation we had, yeah, I could see them doing that. And
isn't that like the worst feeling ever when you're going home in the car
like,
and all of a sudden it clicks and you're like, oh, they seemed a little bit upset for the rest of the conversation after that. And that's not how I meant it at all, but oh no.
Like, oh, and then it's like, well, do I got to talk to him just out of the blue? Maybe not. I don't know. Yeah.
Do I go and do I apologize for something that I didn't actually mean because I'm not sure if they're actually upset or it's such a weird situation. It's just not fun.
Which is exactly what the enemy wants. He wants to just stir up strife or awkwardness or anything that habilitates us to having kind of like God honoring relationship between the two of us, right? That builds something. So I think he's just as happy with that as in almost just straight out anger and such things.
And in every one of those situations that I just described, the answer is always to just go apologize, even if you're not sure if you upset the person.
Yeah.
It's always better to just be like, hey, listen, I'm sorry if that upset you at all. I meant it this way in the context of the conversation. I realized it could be taken like this.
Yeah.
Are you trying to put your foot on the table, dude? What are you...
Dude,
you're killing me.
Just owning this. So now to switch gears just slightly, right? So this is the relationship, say, between a man and his mom. And you can even say maybe between siblings, right? Because they live together for long periods of time in life, especially in the formative years where you're going to be going through all these changes. You're going to be really annoying. Sorry, there's never been a junior hire that hasn't been annoying, myself included, right? And so but then once you get past and you get to this, once you marry and have a wife, right, then things are I think, a little different. And that is that what is so unique and amazing about a spouse, right, and this is obviously in a good relationship, in a godly relationship, is the fact that you live together, choose to live together. You don't choose your mom. You don't choose your dad. You don't choose your sibling. You choose to live together, for better, for worse, for always, right, till death do us part. And you know that they will know all your laundry. They're going to know all your faults. They're going to know all your failures. They're going to know all your quirks. They're going to know all the annoying aspects about you, and they're going to choose to love you anyways. And so then you have that safe space. I hate to use that term, but that safety with them. That it's just not. It's not that aspect is not there amongst, say, the mother relationship, and so it's uniquely different. And I think it's a glorious thing. But it's still a thing that needs to be cultivated, right? It's really still easy to take offense at the little annoying habits of your spouse, your husband, or your wife. But yet there's this different avenue there where we look past that and love them anyways, choose to not berate them for that, and allow that safe space for them to be able to be nurtured and grow, to lead as a man, especially. That's important.
Yeah, and if it's really bad, like you can even you can even communicate it with your wife or with your spouse or whatever, and be like, hey, listen, there's this thing that you did the other day, and I'm not sure if you meant it this way, but I'd like to just bring it up because I took it this way, and I want to make sure that if it happens again, that I don't do the same thing if you don't mean it that way, sort of
right?
Deal, right?
Yeah, exactly. So real quick, Jayce, he talks about in here, I think, a pretty important thing. He says how the idea is making prayers innocuous. How can the enemy make our prayers innocuous?
It's a good question. I think there are a few ways to do it. I would say the one that I think I have the most experience with is just, at least for me, getting the prayers to be unfocused. like kind of going all over the place and struggling to stay focused on, because prayer isn't like, it is something that you can enjoy once you build a rhythm of it. It's work. Like, just like worship is work, like you're offering something up to God and you're trying to have a relationship. You don't just have a relationship with somebody by like, hey, hi, how are you? And then you leave, or asking them for things all the time. It takes effort to interact with. Like, we prepare a lot for these, and this is a big part of our relationship right now, right? We prepare a lot for these, and it takes effort. So praying to God, having a relationship with him takes some effort. And sometimes when you're just there and you can't stay focused on things, it makes your prayers innocuous. They're not really purposeful. They're not centered on things or delivered in ways. Like, there are certain ways the Bible kind of instructs us to pray, right?
Are you talking about like vagary in your prayers?
There's definitely vagary. There's also like vagrancy of just wandering all over the place and not staying focused in the process of it, right?
Okay.
Getting distracted. Maybe, the loud truck drives by your window and you go, oh man, look at that truck that just totally losing where you're at, right? Maybe that's just me. Maybe I have really bad ADD or something. It's never been diagnosed.
Jayce, you're a victim. I just want you to know.
I did. Don't I feel it? So I think that's one, maybe two different ways. I think another way of making prayers innocuous is kind of what Screwtape's encouraging here, of separating the person that you're praying for from their actual like spirit or soul or whatever, and you're basically end up praying for something totally different than the actual person, right? Screwtape brings up multiple times throughout the letters that physical positioning or physical experiences can affect spiritual conditions, right? So like that's why he brings up, don't let him pray for his mother's rheumatism, right? The pain that she's experiencing every day, the aching in her joints. Don't let him pray for that. Have him pray for like her soul or something he doesn't really understand very well.
Right. And that goes right back to this inwardness he talks about for the patient's, on the patient's behalf earlier. He's like, make him inward focused, right? Spiritually focused, make it like a mindset or such things. And here he says the same thing with his mom, like make it spiritual. And when I say spiritual, vague, inward focus, things that he's less aware of, because frankly, God alone knows the hearts of men and the motives. And so he's like, well, get him in that guessing game there. Don't actually allow him to pray for things that are physical or applicable, or like right there present. And he even says, pray for her sins. And he's like, by the way, when I say sins, you can twist that to mean any action which is inconvenient or irritating to himself.
Yeah. Which makes that into like a judgment thing for him. So he's literally praying for her by like judging her. Yeah, he's becoming God in the scenario right here. As he prays.
Right. Because he's like, if the sin is the definition of the sin is it's confronting to me, like which sin, the real definition of sin is obviously missing the mark, but it's confronting to God. Like it's offensive to him, right? Where now he's put himself on God's throne. He's like, no, what I deem to be sin is those things that are irritating to me or inconvenient even to me. And then you're constantly in your quote unquote spiritual duty of prayer, you're constantly focusing in on the negative of the other person and critiquing that. It's going to leak over into your real life too. If you're just always thinking about the things that they need to repent of or change of, and you're praying for it, you're going to find yourself most likely critiquing them in real life and causing all kinds of havoc, in your relationship with them as well.
It's like when you're in church and the pastor says something and you're like, oh, it totally applies to my wife. And you like look at her or whatever, right?
What? Never had this experience.
Well, that quick laugh, that tells me you did. And the pastor like goes, now guys, don't look at your women or whatever. And you're doing everything you can to keep the blinders on. And you're like, just look forward. It's kind of the same idea. I want to talk about this last little bit here, where this last paragraph. Finally, tell me something about the old lady's religious position. Is she at all jealous of the new factor in her son's life? At all piqued that he should have learned from others, and so late what she considers she gave him such good opportunity of learning in childhood? Does she feel he is making a great deal of fuss about it, or that he's getting in on very easy terms? Remember the elder brother in the enemy's story, which is just like a totally random callback to the prodigal son.
All right, I'm not gonna lie. When we first read this, I was like, Jayce, who the heck is the elder brother? You're like, the prodigal. I'm like, oh, like he just said this story. Like Jesus told a bajillion stories, man. He spoke in parables all the time. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely it. That's definitely it.
Or that he's getting in on very easy terms. Like that's the main piece of that when it comes to the elder brother and the enemy story, because he gets so mad when the younger brother comes back and the father celebrates it. And he's like ignoring the party and he won't go to it.
Yep.
And like he's just he's being a whiny baby about it.
It's all bent out of shape, which is really interesting because that parable we always teach. You know, I've always heard it taught mainly about the prodigal son. But if you look at it, the actual emphasis in that is to the Pharisees, and they are the older brother. So in many ways and aspects, that story is actually first and foremost written or brought forth for that older brother. And then, yeah, there's aspects of the prodigal son that's obviously true too, but the emphasis is on the older brother, which we don't even look at very much. In fact, I remember being young, especially before I saved it, and I was like super sympathetic with that older brother. I'm like, yeah, man, like what the heck? This is dumb. And yet, so yeah, he applies that same scenario with her though, like making her seeding or sowing seeds of pride within her and being like, hey man, I offered all this to him and he like turned that down. Now he suddenly has religion and he didn't even have to do anything to earn it, right? Getting in on very easy terms. Yeah, 100%. 100%.
I think it's about time that we close this one up, right? Getting close to close down time.
Well, I don't want to be, real time it's only 2:05 in the morning right now, AM. I think
it's only like the fourth one we've done tonight, right?
One other thing real fast, throw some scripture here. So back when it comes to making prayers innocuous, right? This is, where the whole discussion is talking about relationships, close relationships, people that we live with, right? Or around often, opposing to say the people in the pews next to us, which we may not see that often in daily life. So in Peter, 1 Peter 3:7, it says, husbands likewise dwell with them, that's their wives, with understanding, giving honor to the wife as the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. So there is even this aspect shown in Scripture where our prayers, will be suffered or can be made innocuous or hindered by our relationship to the spouse with us, being, ungodly. All right, Jayce, please lead us in our closing charge.
All right. Let us live peaceably with each other, harbor good habits in our lives, and encourage the eternal beings we come into contact with towards glory and not horror. And remember, if you want to refine your life, choose to refine your faith. We hope to have you with us next time.
Peace.